afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this ESF Insight conversation on how the emergency services sector can have a better, brighter future after COVID. I'm Susan McKenzie, ESF CEO, and today I'll be joined by three people who are eminently qualified to share their thoughts on this topic, and we will be recording this conversation. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where we all are. Today I'm in Lakes Entrance, and you might see that I'm actually in a motel room. I'm on the lands of the gorgeous Gunai Kunai people, and with all fingers and toes crossed that my Wi-Fi keeps connected. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging as we discuss this important topic. I'm here in Gippsland today because tomorrow ESF begins the second phase pilot of our Leading for Better Mental Health program with a group of team leaders from DELP, Forest Fire Management. It was so nice to get in the car this morning and just drive into the countryside and sort of breathe that fresh air. It's the first time I've been down this way since the fires and the floods. And I know from speaking with DELP people just how the shadow of those events have been compounded by COVID down here. The idea of a better, brighter future must at times seem unfathomable. I can't even say it. Unfathomable, you know what I'm saying, for people down this road. Let's see if Andrew Weir can help us be more optimistic. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Susan. Great to be here. I'm joining you from the Wurundjeri country here. So great to be here.
Fantastic. I was a bit tongue-tied there for a moment. Andrew is a director and city economist with the City of Melbourne, but has been a public servant for many years. He's also an author who proposes in his latest book, Recovery, how can we create a better, brighter future after a crisis? And you can see I stole that, that while the pandemic has been the biggest crisis in a generation, our recovery represents an enormous opportunity. Firstly, Andrew, what inspired you to write a book on this topic? Was it a lockdown project?
Yeah, it was a bit of a lockdown project, but I was working fairly frantically in my new job at City of Melbourne, helping businesses in the city deal with the impacts of the pandemic. There were tumbleweeds rolling down the street and businesses going out of business through lack of patronage. And we were just being frenetic, working all hours of day and night, throwing everything we had at it. But it was very present focused. And there was a real moment, I think, at some point when it became abundantly apparent that it was actually, we couldn't live like that all the time. We actually had to think strategically about the months and years and even decade ahead. How do you recover from a global pandemic? And given no one had ever really, that I knew, had recovered from a global pandemic before, the question of how might you go about learning, what insights might you be able to gather, and investigating past recoveries from past crises seemed to be the obvious pathway to generating some insight. So that's what I did in the latest book.
Oh, fantastic. So what have we learned during the pandemic about what matters and what's important?
It's interesting, I think. I think many of the things that we've learned during the pandemic were things that we might have previously also already known, but perhaps have forgotten or let go. I mean, things such as we're all connected. We're all connected, and that public health, for example, is something that health is a public concern, not a private concern. That what happens to other people and their health impacts our health. You know, that sort of sense of connectedness that comes through really matters. After the Spanish flu, for example, that's a very similar sort of insight, but people very, very quickly forgot that. And then public health, and then health turned into a commodity to be bought and sold in the form of medicines or private medical treatments, etc. And so I think it's important we hold on to that notion of public health as being a critical one. And I think what happens, another insight that we learned, I think, during the pandemic was that what happens around the world impacts us at home. This virus originated in China. It spread all around the world. And we've also learned that the solution lies globally. We won't be truly safe from this pandemic until the rest of the world is properly vaccinated. And I think that notion of the broader commons, of how we're all connected, has also some parallels with, say, for example, climate change. We're all connected in climate change. It's a global problem, and until we tackle it at a global level, we're not going to be truly safe. I won't go into too long, and I know we've got a lot to do, but I think there's one also important one that we learned. I think we learned the value of competent government. At a time of crisis, at a time during the pandemic, it is actually quite handy to have a government that is actually vaguely competent. We saw what happened in the US and the UK, and it's very obvious when it's absent. And it was a relief to think, for the most part in Australia, our governments basically had their act together. And the insight that comes from that is that competent government is not something you can switch on. It relies on deep-rooted institutions and cultures and history and capacity amongst public servants and institutions and agencies, and we need to value those. So look, I'll leave it there. I think I'll go on too long, but there's some really good insights, I think, from what we've learned, and we must not forget them. Time and time again, people move on too quickly from a crisis and forget the lessons that they learned.
And no matter what our political persuasion was, and we're all very different, but personally I like seeing someone stand up there every day at the helm and sort of telling us what to do. My sister-in-law told me last night that Boris has told them over in the UK that they're likely to be locked down for Christmas.
Goodness.
I thought, can you imagine what would happen if we were told that here now? I think I hate to think what would be happening in Burke
There'd be many tears.
Yeah. How are things likely to be different after the crisis? I mean, we know how work is different. Suddenly, no, you can't work from home. How can you possibly work from home? Well, actually, yes, we can. But what else is going to be different in terms of cities, governments, systems?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the interesting things, when you go back and look through history at past crises, they often yield some really interesting, profound social changes that aren't immediately apparent, but sometimes take years to sort of wash through. I mean, after the Spanish flu, for example, that killed more working age men than women, it resulted in changes to gender relations and more women doing jobs that they hadn't done beforehand, and ultimately led to the enfranchisement of women in the United States, for example, and all sorts of profound changes, political changes. Arguably, after the global financial crisis, that enabled and facilitated Donald Trump and Brexit, for example, as political consequences. So some of these things we don't know how they're going to shake out. What we do know is that some of the domains where we're going to be looking with interest are about what happens to work. Are we going to be returning to the office? To what extent are we going to return to the office? How is hybrid work going to work? What might that mean for our cities and the relationships between suburbs and central cities, for example? I think are really, really interesting questions. And I think, as some of that shapes out, we're going to really, we've got to be prepared to be a little bit sort of nimble and be prepared to operate in an environment of strategic uncertainty, because there's a lot of questions to which we don't know the answers at the moment.
Yeah.
Will people use public transport again? To what extent will global tourism and for that matter, business tourism, business travel return to the way it was? A whole bunch of uncertain questions. We know things are going to be different, but we don't quite yet know how.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to take a long time for that sort of equilibrium to come back to what is the new normal. So what insights can we get from past recoveries? What can that teach us?
Yeah, there's a lot of insights, and we could go on for a while, but I think there's a few key themes really that come through really quickly. Firstly is that often there's a bounce in the short term after a crisis. People obviously, in the case of a natural disaster or reconstruction, there's money that flows in in the form of reconstruction. But even in the case of a pandemic like this, there's pent up demand. So people want to go out and spend. So there's often a bit of a bounce. But the real question is not what happens in the 6 months or 12 months after the crisis. It's what happens in a decade afterwards. Yeah. And time again, what I looked at past crises, people told me that we wished we'd focus more on economic development, building a strong economy that was able to sustain communities into the medium to longer term, after all the reconstruction workers had gone home, for example. I learned that community-driven recoveries are the most effective when communities are involved in determining their own futures, involved in the delivery of their own recovery efforts. I learned that experimental and creative approaches matter. Like in Christchurch after the earthquakes, a whole bunch of community groups taking vacant spaces where there were demolished buildings and activating them with artworks and creative cultural stuff. That grassroots creative involvement.
That fabulous cathedral.
Yeah, that's right. But the grassroots involvement in driving reinvention of what their city was to become, juxtaposed with a sort of top-down bureaucratic response to crisis and crisis recovery, and that was really, really important too. The social dimensions, reinvestment in the social determinants of health, and going out with a big ambition. And I think that's probably the big one for me, is that the big successful recoveries reflected very carefully on what sort of future they wanted to create for their city or their region or their country, and developing a new post-crisis vision that was ambitious, and then they went after it. It wasn't about going back to what was. It was actually about creating a new future after the crisis. And invariably, when you look at it from a long perspective, like a decade-long perspective, the capacity to achieve remarkable improvements and change a decade after a crisis is quite phenomenal.
Okay. It's interesting then with, if we build back better and we think that we could use this period to sort of tackle important intersecting challenges. You mentioned crisis change already. Maybe I missed it, but certainly over the last couple of weeks at COP, I didn't hear sort of COVID and climate issues in the same sentence. But challenges like climate change and inequality, they're both issues of great importance to the emergency services and management sector. Do you think that it's an opportunity to tackle those sort of intersecting things?
I think it's an opportunity and a necessity. In fact, I think in thinking about our recovery, it's not really a recovery unless we're also responding in a very proactive and strong way to the challenges that we're going to face in future. So there's the intersecting challenges from COVID, for example, are the challenges that existed beforehand: climate change, obviously, inequality, the strength of our democracy. We need to be tackling those. And many countries are. If you look at countries like South Korea and Germany, for example, they've got massive economic stimulus, and they're using that stimulus to tackle climate change, build new industries that are zero carbon and help them advance towards zero carbon. And they're taking the opportunity of stimulus to drive them in that direction. But then there's also future crises that we're inevitably going to bump into during our recovery. I mean, the pandemic, and your sector knows this better than anyone, is that the pandemic originated, in March 2020, just as we were in the midst of recovery from those massive East Coast bushfires. It's inevitable that as we recover from COVID, we will bump into other crises, whether that be natural disasters, which are getting more frequent and more intense because of climate change. And we need to be aware of those intersecting crises and making sure that we're on the front foot, being ready for them, taking our recovery to make sure that we're better positioned, more resilient, able to deal with future crises as well. That's a really critical step as well, I think.
So should we be optimistic about the future?
I think inevitably we absolutely should be optimistic. There are no shortage of examples from around the world, from past crises, where places haven't just recovered from crisis, they've actually gone on to create that better, brighter future that we talked about in the introduction, whether that be the roaring 20s after the Spanish flu, the New Deal and the big recovery from the Great Depression, or Germany after World War II in the decades ahead going on to boom, South Korea after the Korean War, Christchurch reinventing itself after the earthquakes, Aceh after tsunami. There's all sorts of examples of places that have actually rebuilt, recovered, and have leapfrogged ahead. And I think we should be optimistic that we can do that too, but we've got to make the right policy choices. We've got to be ambitious with what our recovery and what our future plans and hopes and aspirations are.
And I'm hearing you say we've got to have the right mindset to do that.
Indeed. And I think there's a couple of examples through history that are really interesting. You look back to the 1920s, for example, which was after World War I and after the Spanish flu were in quick succession. In the UK, they had the mindset of, we were really dominant before World War I. We were the home of the industrial age and steam engines and everything. So after the Spanish flu, we want to go back to 1913, create things the way they were back in 1913. In the US, they said, well, we didn't have that industrial age. We want to go forward. We want to experiment with electricity and internal combustion engines and science and go forward. And so what we saw was actually the US go forward into the Roaring 20s, and the UK experienced a decade of stagnation. And I think we need to be really careful that we are actually thinking about creating a new future, not about rebuilding the old past. And that's a really, really critical decision that we need to make, I think.
That's fantastic, Andrew. Thank you for that. I'm going to sort of move over and speak to John Richardson now. And John is very well known to many of you, I'm sure. He's the National Resilience Advisor for Australian Red Cross, Honorary Fellow of the University of Melbourne in Global and Public Health, focusing on the health and wellbeing trajectories of the Black Saturday bushfires. He's been invited by the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction to be part of global risk assessment framework working groups. He's worked closely with disaster-affected individuals and communities for many years, and he's led the development of Red Cross's unique Preparedness Ready plan. That was a mouthful, John.
Welcome. Too many words.
Welcome. So Thanks. It was interesting listening to Andrew talking about the recovery principles, because I know they're very obviously the bread and butter of what you do. So the national principles for disaster recovery speak about community, just like Andrew did, and community-led recovery. How can we facilitate this in the pandemic recovery? How can we get community-led recovery?
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Andrew, for your previous comments. And also, just want to acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Bunurong people here in the Kulin Nation. Pay respects to elders past and present. Great question, Susan, because I think one of the challenges potentially that we sort of see with the pandemic is we kind of treat it separately to sort of the sort of disaster or emergency management sort of framework that we sort of employ, and so we're sort of thinking, well, COVID is different, pandemic is different. Really strong sort of emphasis on sort of economic recovery, which, you know, and they're the sorts of impacts that I think we can see in a sort of tangible way. You know, it's pretty apparent. So we kind of sort of think, oh, well, you know, we've just got to sort of focus on getting sort of a lot of those sort of economic sort of levers right. But, you know, as Andrew was sort of saying, you know, it's a lot more complex than that. And that's the thing, that, you know, recovery is sort of a complex system. It has, you know, a number of different domains. You know, work that we've been doing with the University of Melbourne around recovery capitals, you know, looks at like 7 domains. You know, we're used to the 4 domains that many of us have been sort of working with over the past few years, but, you know, work that we've been doing sort of looks, you know, now at 7 domains, which is sort of adding cultural, political, and human to the sort of built social, economic, and natural. So, you know, seeing that, you know, being complex. But I think if we flip to a consequence approach, which, you know, we're very familiar with here in Victoria, then, you know, we look at, you know, well, what are the issues that we need to deal with? And this is sort of where the recovery principles, I think, are really useful. And so, you know, community-led, as sort of Andrew said, I mean, you need, this needs to happen because we need, so for people to have ownership of the challenges and feel sort of comfortable where they're going. Otherwise, potentially they sort of feel shut out of the processes, And I think, again, sort of picking up sort of what Andrew was just saying, kind of shut out of sort of processes, you get disengaged. If you get disengaged, then you may feel disenfranchised, and that can lead to a whole range of sort of societal challenges. So, bringing people in, we have the structures in our sort of already in our emergency management system. Whether it is through the establishment of community recovery committees, or whether it's using the existing municipal emergency management committees, being able to put this on the table as a topic that needs to be considered, making sure that it's a participatory approach, because I think that's one of the challenges that we sometimes have with community-led, is that it's community-led for the sort of 5 or 6 people who always turn up and are always the joiners. They also happen to be the coach of the netball or football club and a whole range of other things. But really reaching out into communities, looking at community organisations that are representative of diverse populations, making sure that we've engaged with the likes of, I guess, that sort of represent our social infrastructure. Whether it is the football, netball clubs, people who organise festivals, local small businesses, really important. Particularly the ones that are pivotal in and have those sort of roles in communities. So we know how to do this. We do this. It's just sort of thinking, we can actually apply this in a sort of pandemic setting.
So, I mean, it sounds to me like really, as agencies in the sector, every agency should be sitting down and posing this question to itself. How can we have a better, brighter future as an agency? And then the units that are in the towns and the communities can be doing that as at a community level as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the thing with the pandemic is that it's affected us all. So it's different, perhaps in some ways, to bushfire or flood, where it's kind of impacts certain areas. It's affected everyone in different ways, and so this should be on committee of management meetings agendas, or board meetings agendas, to say, okay, well, what does this mean for us into the future? How can we contribute? Because we all have a role to play, and then one of the principles of recovery is acknowledging and building capacity. So using those capacities that sort of already exist and building off them. Then again, being able to sort of insert yourself into those conversations that are happening locally, and if they're not happening, then raise them. And I think that's again, for members of the foundation, we are all advocates in a way. So it's an opportunity to be kind of raising these questions. Well, what role are we going to play here? What are we going to do? Is this going to be an issue for us? And the challenge, I think, is that people will think, we just want to snap back. We just want to be able to go to the pub or go away for the weekend, and that's our main focus. And again, that's pretty normal. We sort of see that in the kind of curve post-disaster, where you do have that sort of really heightened coming together. But then the slog, the long hard slog, will begin, and we need to be kind of thinking through that and planning it.
So, how can the sector use the pandemic experience to, specifically the sector, to give us hope for a better, brighter future? Do you think or do you think the idea of what we've just talked about really answers that?
I think to some degree, but I also think let's look at the sorts of things that have happened through the pandemic, and so be really mindful that for all of the challenges that we see, and be really mindful at the moment. There's I guess a lot of the narrative around sort of pandemic has turned towards the negative, for various reasons. But if you sort of think back to sort of last year, where collaboration was really paramount. Organisations were working with organisations that they'd never worked with, and they were working quickly. And there was a great degree of resourcefulness, both within the community and both within agencies. Think about how we flipped from all sitting at a desk to all sitting at home within matter of days and that sort of thing. There were new lines of communications. People took action. So the other thing I think is really important for us to recognise is that that when people are asked to do something for the greater good of the community, i.e., stay home or i.e., roll up their sleeves, they did it. Now, some commentators have sort of said, Australians we're really a submissive lot, and I would say no. What we've done is we've assessed kind of what the risk is. We've been told by the experts this is what we need to do, and we'll do it for the greater good. Now, if we can kind of unlock that, that piece of the puzzle in terms of thinking about our bushfire preparedness, about our flood cyclone preparedness, then we can already build off that. People have already done those sorts of things. So I think there's real opportunity to be picking out these sorts of these elements that we've seen that have worked really well, remind people of this and sort of say, this is what you did. What we're asking you to do here is really no different. It's just sort of building off it. And when we ask you to do this as an organisation, at that point you didn't say, no, that's not my job, or I'm not funded to do that. We kind of did it. So I think we can use these sorts of elements to help have the conversations now and build off that sort of capacity that I guess we developed and capability that we developed as a sector and a community.
I really get the sense that there was this great feeling that anything is possible. For example, with us, we had programs that were scheduled to be face-to-face. We suddenly turned into this online program, which turned out to be incredibly successful, that I wouldn't have anticipated ever doing that way. And I just got this really strong feeling that people felt, well, anything is possible. You can't go this way, but we can go that way.
Yeah, I mean, it was a highly stressful time, and I think that's the thing. But equally, at times of high stress, high risk, potentially sort of high reward as well. And those are sorts of things we probably sort of need to recognise. And there's a sort of phenomena that we sort of see, post-traumatic growth, where people can go through a really sort of stressful and traumatic sort of situation, and they have to sort of go. It has to be traumatic for them to sort of transform and adapt. And I think this is what we've sort of done as a community. I mean, we've done a bit of work on sort of this notion of collective trauma, which has primarily been sort of focused more on the sort of impact of violent events and the like. But collective trauma is that sort of thing, that sort of event that actually society changes the way it sort of thinks about itself and the way it responds. And so because we were able to sort of pivot and do a lot of things really, really quickly, I think there's great opportunity for us to sort of to build off that.
So you've talked about post-traumatic growth, but what do you think are the long-term psychosocial impacts of the pandemic?
I think this will certainly have a long tail, and as Andrew said, we be thinking about this in terms of years to decades, which is what we see with other disasters, whether the bushfires. The work we've done through University of Melbourne, we're still seeing a very long tail from that over 10 years after. So So some of the evidence from sort of previous pandemics and epidemics suggests that there will be so serious mental health issues, anxiety, depression, and the like, sort of as we sort of go forward. We also, there's a whole sort of there will be a sense of grief, and for particularly, I think for young people, and I've got two sort of teenage daughters who, one has had their sort of ECE completely disrupted over the last 2 years. And another one was, she was planning to do a gap year overseas last year, so couldn't do all those sorts of things. So many of those kind of formative experiences that young people undertake have been disrupted, and they're not likely to get those back. So potential for a whole lot of grief that sort of needs to be resolved. There's a sort of that notion of that we've been through a languishing, which was feeling like that this we're not just getting anywhere. And I suppose there's always the potential fear of what might come next. So we're already, as you were sort of saying, we're already looking to Europe again, and we're looking to what's sort of happening there. That potentially could be sort of provoking, anxiety.
Do you think on the flip side, though, that these kids that have had their schooling disrupted, do you think it could make them incredibly resilient?
Yes, I do. I think again that's that sort of notion of post-traumatic growth. So they've gone through something that's really stressful, and come out the other side. So I think for some, yes. I mean, not everyone, and everyone reacts in different ways. But if I look at my own daughter, who's recently moved out and set up her own place on all on her own without any assistance from us. Now that probably wouldn't have happened 2 years ago, but she actually went and signed the lease and signed up the electricity and broadband and all that sort of stuff. And I thought, wow, that's being really resourceful. And I wouldn't have expected you to be able to do that a couple of years ago. But because she lost sort of her work, was at home with us, full time. She took on a lot of the running of the household while we were working. So yeah, I think there will be certainly an element of that, and being able to look back on that.
So what about yourself, John? What have you learnt about looking after yourself in that post-disaster period? Long and short term, to build, the longevity of your own career. Because we often hear about people working in that recovery space. It just wears them out and they leave, and then we lose all that experience and knowledge. What have you done to look after yourself?
Yeah. I mean, I've survived 24 something years. So, look, I think it's a great question. Prioritizing self-care and sort of health and well-being is important. So bringing that to the fore, having a good family support. So that's been really important. Support of sort of friends. I even during COVID, like with my 1 hour a day, I used to go out and kick a football with one of my friends, and sort of try and alternate that sort of each day. So I kind of get, and you have that kind of connection. So social connection is really important. Doing the things that you like I like to listen to a lot of music. So I would listen to music and listen to it really deeply. One of the things I did was that when I did read, I would read fiction that would take me well away from what we were experiencing. It could have been historical fiction. It could be set overseas. So I think, just that sort of prioritization. I've been fortunate, fortunate. I mean, I've earned it, I suppose, but I've taken sort of 5 months long service leave this year. That's probably been the best thing I've done in a long time, because it allowed me to sort of refresh and regenerate.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Thanks very much for that. I'm going to move on to Carmel now. Carmel Flynn is the CEO at Bushfire Recovery Victoria, and that's the agency that was established in January 2020 as a dedicated and permanent Victorian government agency to coordinate the recovery from the 2019-2020 Eastern Victorian bushfires and provide strategic leadership and a whole of government approach to recovery. But of course, more recently, that's included floods and storms as well. So Carmel brings to that role over 20 years of experience working as an executive in emergency management across government, not-for-profit and the corporate sectors. Hello, Carmel.
Hello, Susan. Thanks for having me. And I'm coming to you and your audience from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And I too pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and do so in my organisation BRV's commitment to reconciliation and to Aboriginal peoples self-determining their recovery from natural disasters.
Lovely. Thank you, Carmel. So really this conversation came about as a consequence of a conversation you and I had as a starting point. So I'm going to go straight to the nub of it. Does our sector need to consider its own recovery to create a better, brighter future? And, how can we learn from the recent experience of all of the significant emergencies that we've gone through in terms of our workforce to be better prepared for a resilient future?
Yeah, absolutely, Susan. The emergency management sector firstly needs to recover from the recovery of the last couple of years, but also at the same time, our sector needs to reaffirm its commitment to its own sustainability for the future. Andrew talked about, the undeniable facts that there's going to be more disasters, more different types of disasters, more disasters with significant consequences. And so, we do need to be prepared for those, and we need to make sure that our work colleagues also are, have the health and sustainability to cope with that. So, we know our work colleagues are community members themselves, and they both experience the event directly as well as work in response or recovery. So, we're often, coping with a number of both personal and professional challenges at the same time. So as a sector and as organisations within the sector, we absolutely have to prioritise our workforce health and well-being, and we really need to think about how we deliver our services too, so we are sustainable into the future.
And do you see that as being something that the sector should consider collectively, or is it something that agencies should go off, and do on their own?
We can only really do it collectively. I think, Susan, we just simply no longer have the capacity to work as sort of silos of organisations in emergency management. And we can see, as me being part of the public service over the last 2 years, I think almost every public servant of some sort has been seconded or has worked, to assist in the COVID recovery. And so we absolutely need to be broad-based, learn from other organisations in the sector, look at what's working in some areas better than others, and also look to share workforces where that makes sense.
So can you please give us some examples of how bushfire recovery has created an opportunity for a better future for some impacted communities? So how they've come out of it and, they're feeling good.
Yeah, I've been really privileged to have seen some really inspirational examples and stories of communities that have sort of grown and evolved after the bushfires. So if I just use one example, the small community of Sarsfield. So prior to the 2019-20 bushfires, Sarsfield was considered like a satellite suburb just outside of Bairnsdale. And the residents that lived there were essentially commuter families. So there was no corner shop, there was no post office, there was no school. Residents simply, lived in this suburb out of town, and it just saw its residents travelling elsewhere for work, for school, for recreation, and things like medical and business services. When the fires came through in January of 2020, about 20 houses were lost in that suburb, and that was really significant for a small township. But fairly quickly, the residents formed a community recovery committee, and John mentioned community recovery committees as well. And 18 months on, these volunteers essentially have made huge inroads to establish a true sense of Sarsfield, the community identity. The residents sort of used the committee to rally quickly to support their neighbours who'd lost their homes and businesses because of the fires. And then through the recovery process, they came together, they put on a cricket match and played in a friendly cricket match with the Clifton Creek Community Recovery Committee, which had also been devastated by the fires. The children of Sarsfield came together and participated in a Sarsfield Snaps photo competition that was designed to help them with their own recovery. And so, the fires were a really tragic event for Sarsfield, but really out of that event, a true community has emerged that wasn't there before, and they're now able to have these cohesive conversations about the possibilities and priorities for their future.
Oh, that's fantastic. I actually drove through Sarsfield today. When we tend to take a very linear approach to emergency management, we prepare, respond, recover. But to me, that seems no longer relevant as so many events are overlapping. You don't get to have your fire and then you do all that recovery and then you take a big breath and then you get ready for next year. And that approach also seems to neglect any focus on the well-being of those doing the work. Naturally, being from ESF, I think that's required for a better, brighter future. What do you think?
I completely agree with you, Susan. Of course, it's really, really important. My organisation, Bushfire Recovery Victoria, was established in January 2020. And we quickly learnt the effects of operating across multiple disasters because, of course, COVID hit, just a month later in February 2020. And then also since then, we've stood up and supported community recovery after the major storm and flood event of the 9th and 10th of June. So we've really seen how overlapping disasters have got compounding effects on both the community and on our workforce. And we found that we've had to really sort of structurally adapt in being able to cope with the multiple disasters. And we've also looked across the recovery sector and seen how the recovery sector as a whole has had to adapt as well. And part of that is really looking at, have we got the right skill sets? Have we got the right focus on a sustainable workforce? Have we got the right numbers of people? We've sort of come back to it's about being fit for purpose, in what is an ever-changing environment, and definitely having the right, health and well-being capacities and capabilities in place is really foundational. So, that includes for us making sure that we have, as an organisation and as people working in recovery, that we have a very good understanding of trauma, both on disaster impacted communities, but also on our workforce and on ourselves as individuals.
Yes, certainly with the Leading for Better Mental Health program yesterday, we had 33 people sitting around in a circle, and I'll admit I was brought to tears just looking around that room and realising the impact of trauma on that group of people in that room, of everything. It was just profound. And, we've all been to meetings. I've said it. We've all seen on TV. Lee Sales says it just about every night. There's a throwaway line, if you need support, call EAP or Lifeline, for example. we know from research, few people do that. You know, they don't reach out to that.
Yeah.
What are the better alternative messages that we could be giving people in the sector?
Yes. Well, I mean, EAP is just one part of an overall strategy. I think personally, it's sort of like a universal service that might be useful as an initial triage. But what we've focused on really intently as an organisation is having messaging that's consistent, that's frequent, and that's really authentic. About the overarching view of our organisation, that the health and safety and wellbeing of our people is our number one priority. So, we look to back that up through our practices. Every Wednesday is a Wellbeing Wednesday. Every Friday is a shout out and a recognition of other colleagues. We, through our induction processes, through our education processes, we also do engage experts such as Dr. Rob Gordon and others who specialise in assisting recovery workforces. So we can recognise and understand trauma, both PTSD as well as post-traumatic growth, and the different impacts that trauma can have on individuals, workforces, and communities. So to do it properly, we require an overarching strategy with many prongs. And for us too, part of that, Susan, is being part of ESF and having the opportunity to listen to other organisations in our sector about what works for them and what they have found, and sharing those experiences. And that knowledge across the sector also helps us be better ourselves.
And there's a question that somebody's posed here, and it says, in Victoria, who is the state recovery coordinator for the pandemic? Is it Department of Health or BRV? Or in fact, has anyone even been appointed to this sort of, has the bigger question even been raised?
Yeah, I've certainly raised it. It's not BRV, I can tell you that. So under the Emergency Management Act, the Emergency Management Commissioner is the recovery coordinator for all hazards. But interestingly enough, he hasn't actually been designated at this time, and that it's my understanding that government is sort of taking a holistic approach to recovery, and and the Premier, if you like, through DPC is looking at what are the appropriate sort of recovery supports across government. So there hasn't been a formal announcement or a formal designation. So we do wait a little bit with bated breath to see if there will be one.
But we can say, can't we, Carmel, that this is a question that the ESF Stakeholder Council, so that's the heads of agency, have raised and have discussed, and we are doing some work on this for the sector, which is terrific.
Yes.
We might bring Andrew and John back on the screen now. And I'm not sure another question that's here is, are there concerns people are mentally switching off to dangers as the pandemic keeps rolling on? A bit like pandemic fatigue, e.g. Back to international holidays, So who would like to answer that? John, I'm looking at you.
Okay. The music stopped. I'm still standing.
Yes.
Look, yes, there are. I think there would be concerns that the pandemic's not over. The threat has not passed us by, and we're still seeing the sort of potential impacts that it has. And to Andrew's point as well earlier, where none of us are safe until all of us are safe. I think that's a big question. So people do fatigue. Like we have seen this, in terms of I guess the compliance with some of the public health directions from last year through, sort of 5 lockdowns. That has certainly waned, and so it is hard for people to kind of maintain the sort of rigor. And I suppose, we've also, I remember also this in Bright in 2003 with the Alpine bushfires, where, it was, the township was sort of threatened for, I think, 60 odd days. And, each night the fire would come down and kind of threaten the town, and then it would go away. And people in the township and them were almost getting to the point where some of them were sort of saying, look, just let it burn. Like, we just want it to, because we need some resolution. So it is challenging. And it's probably where we need to kind of keep shifting and sort of changing messages so that people hear something new. So that otherwise it becomes sort of basically white noise.
Just on a related note, I'm concerned that we will move on to quickly after the pandemic and not properly capture the lessons learned, and then we'll forget. That's why I actually a big advocate at the moment for a royal commission into the pandemic, not to point the finger and find fault, but to capture the lessons learned, make recommendations about things that need to be put in place and improved, so that we've got a record, effectively of all the insights and lessons that we've learned, a bit like we did after the 2009 bushfires with the Royal Commission, and then government implemented almost all of those recommendations. I mean, it would be appropriate, I think, sometime in the near future to do something similar this time around too.
And Andrew, I think, sorry, just following on from that, and then, is also some form of healing process as well. I think that's, again, we sort of see this as a key activity in other disasters where we commemorate, we memorialise, a healing process which helps us make sense and make meaning of the events. Goes also parts of the way of what we're sort of talking about, understanding and learning, and gives people the ability to kind of to look at that as a starting point for healing.
It'd be interesting, what a broader community healing process would look like. Have you got any ideas?
I don't have any ideas, but I think it's a fabulous notion, because you can see how divisive COVID has been, and in different phases. Right at the very beginning, there was outward racism within Melbourne, towards the Chinese community, and then it turned to international tennis players. but I joke at that, but it has been, and now it's those that don't believe in vaccination, and it has been incredibly divisive towards many sectors of society. And absolutely, how we can through appropriate healing commemorations really reflect on that and look to restore healthy social fabric in our society would be a great idea.
Pretty amazing. Andrew, I haven't asked you anything. You're not from our sector, but you've heard two people from the sector speak today. I'm sure you understand a little bit about it. From an outsider looking in, what do you think is something that our sector could be doing to have a brighter future going forward?
Yeah. The thing that strikes me, and you feel free to jump on me when I say this, but the thing that strikes me is that pandemic really wasn't on the radar before it hit. It wasn't really in ESV's sort of agenda really at all. And so I wonder whether we need to be thinking more broadly about what a crisis is or could be. We tend to assume it's natural disaster, but crises come from all different directions and in all different forms, and so that's one thing that leaps out at me in terms of no one had pandemic really on their agenda in any real way, so how prepared for a pandemic was the sector in your mind, and what has the sector learned from it this time around?
Well, there were some people who had actually thought about it, because we'd done a bit of a mock crisis thing as part of a conference a couple of years before, where the theme was pandemic, but it all seemed so far-fetched at the time that I'm not sure how seriously it was taken. There's a couple of comments here. Somebody's saying, please, no, Royal Commission. Couldn't we create some great reflective spaces to learn, to make meaning, to kind of think about our collective experience? And somebody else has said, Royal Commission, great idea. I wonder what the chances are of having a Royal Commission to investigate lessons of the pandemic. So, I mean, even to do it not as a Royal Commission, but to do it as this reflective space would be a new, better way of doing things, wouldn't it?
Yep.
And I can tell you that's actually on our radar for the sector in our planning for the recovery is an idea to do something like that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm very conscious of the time. Would one last comment from each of you? Carmel, what would you say on this topic?
I'll just go with Andrew's last observation, and say we have got to be able to better expect the unexpected, because we should have seen this coming. History has told us that, and we weren't nearly as prepared as what we should have been. So expect the unexpected, but also, for the future, really, learn to work with, community at the centre, and make sure that we're partnering well with our communities.
John, what about you?
Yeah, I think similarly, learning, but not managing the last disaster, because that's what we tend to do. Focus is off. We had a bushfire, so suddenly our plan looks like the sort of bushfire plan. Being able to try and elevate up. I will say, there has been pandemic planning, but somewhere along the line, it must have got lost, because I know, in the mid-2000s, I was certainly heavily involved in that. But so being able to keep, how do we keep all these balls in front of everyone's eyes, I think, is so that it is there. But I think just being able to sort of look, forward focus, anticipate those challenges, those kind of black swan type challenges, not black swan necessarily, but that sort of that idea that we're going to be challenged, and but with the resources and the resourcefulness that we've displayed, we can actually meet these challenges.
And Andrew, last word from you.
I'll finish with just a note of optimism. I think we need to be thinking about how we embrace the opportunity that our recovery presents, and go into this period with a sense of possibility, with a sense of optimism, and really use this moment to create that better future. And I think there are too many examples of places that have actually gone on to create a better future for themselves, not to be optimistic about the future, about the opportunity, the recreating the world that we want to see. This is an amazing opportunity, and we should grasp it.
Thank you very much. And if anybody's interested in reading Andrew's book, we will put out an e-news in the next day or so, and there will be a link to that, and you'll be able to get that off our website if you aren't on our mailing list. And as I said, there'll be a recording to this as well if you think somebody else would like to hear it. So I'll just say thank you very much to Carmel, John and Andrew for joining us today for this ESF Insight conversation. They're always great conversations, and people seem to really enjoy them. So thank you very much for your time and contribution.
Thanks, Susan.
Susan.
Great job.
Pleasure.